Regarded by fellow members of the mighty handful as simultaneously its most brilliant member and its biggest idiot, he lived a life filled with far too much tragedy. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Modest Mussorgsky. Modest Mussorgsky was born technically as Modest Musorgsky in a rural area in the northwest part of the Russian Empire in March 1839. The G sound in his name, Mussorgsky versus Musorgsky, is a great point of confusion for enthusiasts and scholars alike, as his family never seemed to spell it exactly the same way twice. This G sound in his name initially appeared when he was in his mid-20s, and it seems to have been inconsistently used and perhaps even silent. Its addition prevented certain puns from being made on his name based on its relationship or similarity to the Russian word musor, which means garbage. We also know that originally his name had emphasis on the first syllable, since emphasis can be a little funky in Russian. Despite how you want to pronounce it with the second syllable, whether or not you have the G, it was either Musorgsky or Musorgsky. But this added character to Westerners unfamiliar with Russian pronunciation rules shifted the emphasis to the second syllable. Pronouncing Mussorgsky's name like I just did, Mussorgsky, seems to have been supported by his older brother Philaret, who was a little more sensitive to name-based wordplay. I mean, following exactly correct Russian pronunciation rules, you could still say it as Musorgsky. No one really says that anymore. You put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. In any event, this family, no matter what you want to call them, was a noble family, and they claimed descent from one of the founding figures of Russia. When Modest was 6, he started piano lessons from his mother, and by the time he reached double digits, he was playing some pretty difficult pieces. He got along very well with children of lower status families, especially serfs, and for this reason he was hailed by Soviet authorities as a true man of the proletariat. He was destined, as was custom for second-born sons of the nobility, to go into the military, and that's how he ended up in St. Petersburg when he was 10 years old. While he continued in music as best he could, he went into the School for Guards Cadets when he was barely a teenager. This place got mixed reviews. 7 years before Mussorgsky got there, the geographer Pyotr Semyonov-Tianshansky was a pupil, and he liked it a lot. But a decade after Mussorgsky's matriculation, composer Nikolai Kompanievsky recorded a deeply strange environment where the dictator, a General Sutkov, all but encouraged alcoholism in his students. Philaret reported that his kid brother was treated quite well. He took piano lessons alongside the general's daughter, but the hazing that some of the new recruits went through would be classified as torture today. At this school, he composed his first piece, or at least first surviving piece, and also there met a Father Krupski, a Russian priest who was familiar with both the Roman Catholic and Byzantine music traditions. Philaret reported that his brother was well-read, well-liked, and graduated near the top of his class. Kompanievsky was a minor composer almost a decade Mussorgsky's junior, and he reported that because Mussorgsky always played his compositions from memory, they never exactly came out the same way twice. Although it must be noted that Kompanievsky's memoirs are not considered to be a reliable source by almost any scholar. In October 1856, Mussorgsky was stationed at a military hospital in St. Petersburg, and it was there that he met Alexander Borodin, the composer, chemist, and sometime surgeon, and a few months later met Alexander Dargomishsky, who was impressed by Mussorgsky's talent at the keyboard. It was through Dargomishsky's musical evenings that Mussorgsky met the other members of the mighty handful, first through playing piano duets with fellow military man Cesar Cui, who introduced him to Mily Balakirev. Balakirev, an equally skilled pianist, prioritized the teaching and understanding of musical form above all else, because that's one of the things he actually really knew how to teach. Because Mussorgsky's training had been at the piano, he knew nothing of any other music, and Balakirev was happy to expose him to everything he theretofore missed. But his teaching didn't go into any significant amount of detail, and so while it fired Mussorgsky's imagination, he didn't know how to turn all of his great ideas into, like, for instance, the first movement of a sonata. This kind of rudimentary training would go on for 5 years and would classify as the most formal training that Mussorgsky ever received. Despite Balakirev's own financial difficulties and the fact that Mussorgsky's mom was willing to pay for lessons, Balakirev declined to be paid, saying that it was inappropriate for musical conversations between friends. Musorgsky was widely hailed in the group for his improvisational abilities, his sight reading, his pianism, and his great ability to accompany anything. But they did have some reservations about his compositional chops. or his perceived lack thereof. Musorgsky was discharged from the military in 1858 for domestic reasons, and this allowed him to devote his life as much as possible to music. This was not the best financial option, as parents, friends, and even Balakirev himself encouraged him not to do this, with the reason being that he had barely written anything at all. Well, here's the thing, he started a bunch of pieces, but he very rarely finished any of them. So Balakirev told him to write a symphonic allegro, and Musorgsky tried, but he didn't have the faintest idea of how to do this. Balakirev had never taught him. Like the rest of the mighty handful, his theoretical knowledge was severely limited, and this led him to suffer some kind of nervous breakdown. We don't know many of the details of this period in his life, but we do know that it had prevented him from writing a lot of music, which sadly would become a theme in the life of old Modeste. He was capable of getting a lot done in a short period of time. He had this enormous energy that he could tap into, but he had very little work ethic. QE summed it up best in a letter he sent to Balakirev in the late 1850s. Modeste is probably spending half the day thinking about what he did yesterday, and the other half of the day thinking about what he's gonna do tomorrow. Boom! Roasted! It wasn't like he wasn't composing, really. He started these projects with great enthusiasm, and then when the going got tough, which it inevitably does when you're writing a piece and editing it and getting into the weeds, he lost enthusiasm for these projects. Musorgsky did get his first premiere in 1860, when Anton Rubinstein conducted his Scherzo in B-flat, which he'd written in 1858 and orchestrated with the help of Balakirev. However, his consistent productivity issue was compounded because this coincided with a time of deep unrest in Russia. The serfs were emancipated in 1861. Overnight, the Musorgsky estate lost half of its wealth, and the other half was slowly circling the drain because the serfs were in charge of, keeping it up. He was obliged to try to do what little he could to save the family fortune, but there was nothing anyone could do. Ironically, the very thing he'd wanted for so long, for humanity and agency to be conferred upon this lowest class, was what left him impoverished. He ended up in St. Petersburg in the 1860s, having taken a civil servant post somewhere deep in the bowels of the Ministry of Transport, and lived with 5 roommates. They called themselves the Commune. And then in 1865, his mother passed away, and it's from then that we can really trace Musorgsky's deep and problematic relationship with alcohol. He ever more frequently turned to alcohol to drown his sorrows, and this was sadly a theme that lasted for the rest of his life. The best thing you could say about his addiction was that he wasn't a violent drunk. He was just incredibly self-destructive. Like every member of the group, aside from Balakirev, Musorgsky had operatic ambitions, but this is something that could make or break a composer. QE was constantly writing operas, and have you ever been to a production of a César QE opera? I mean, I don't think so. Nobody has. Boom! Roasted! Musorgsky was particularly drawn to realism, that is, reflecting the lived experiences of characters on stage as much as possible, down to impacting the musical language and the form. And in this, he was greatly influenced by Nikolai Chernyshevsky, an early populist and socialist philosopher who said that the primary purpose of art is to reproduce reality. This was an excellent artistic stance for an aspiring opera composer, but proved somewhat problematic in any non-staged work. When you compound this with the fact that opera takes a long time and a lot of dedication to writing, and Musorgsky wasn't the most dedicated to certain projects, and you can see how he left many operatic projects in the planning stages or just barely sketched out. His first attempt at an opera was a work called Salambo, which he worked on between 1863 and 1866, but he only ever wrote 6 numbers. Aside from operatic ambitions, in 1867 he produced a tone poem called St. John's Eve on the Bare Mountain. This was intended to depict a witch's sabbath on the titular mountain. This project seems to have originated in an opera that he planned in 1858 called St. John's Eve. When he completed the piece, he showed it to Balakirev, who didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot conductor's baton, but Musorgsky always liked it and tried to find ways of integrating it into his future projects. At this point, Balakirev and Musorgsky were not seeing eye to eye, and ironically, by the time the critic Vladimir Stasov called this group of 5 composers the Mighty Handful in 1867, Musorgsky no longer really cared about what his one-time mentor thought of his work. Instead, as the other 3 were also beginning to at this time, he was more influenced by Dramatist, and in particular his Pushkin setting The Stone Guest. Dramatist had a similar artistic outlook when it came to realism in opera and text setting, and this sparked Musorgsky's imagination enough for him to write a good chunk of an opera. This was a setting of Nikolai Gogol's The Marriage, but Musorgsky abandoned this after drafting just 1 act. But even though he never saw this project through, he learned something about his own dramatic inclinations and musical style. He wanted his text settings to be as close to actual spoken Russian as possible. But that's a far more difficult challenge than perhaps any other language. Russian doesn't have a lot of flowing consonants, which make for nice melodic melismas, as you would find in the Italian bel canto tradition. Part of the reason that the Italians came up with bel canto was because they had a language that was suited for it. Russian just isn't. Additionally, Musorgsky wanted all of his characters to be characterized through their speech patterns. And he wanted to eliminate the distinction between the plot-pausing and melodic arias versus the plot-driving, largely syllabic recitatives. The distinction between aria and recitative had been the formula for operas since the genre really began, and trying to eliminate that at the same time that you were trying to rethink how characters expressed their words on stage, and he had a lot on his plate. He would speak of his work on the marriage as an exercise of a musician, or rather a non-musician, desirous of studying and mastering the flexes of human speech. But from a practical career standpoint, Musorgsky was about 30 years old, and had yet to write literally almost anything. Night on Bald Mountain, as his tone poem would come to be called, wouldn't be premiered until after his death, and even then in a different version. Facing this prospect head-on, he wrote and actually completed an opera called Boris Godunov, about the 16th century Tsar of the same name. But the Mariinsky Theater had a lot of very particular rules about operatic productions. It stipulated, among other things, that you can only produce evening-long operas, that you could never, unless you got special permission, depict a member of the Romanov dynasty on the stage, you had to have a leading soprano and leading tenor role, you had to have a love plot, and ideally you had to have dancing as well. And also whatever the censors didn't like had to go. Boris Godunov was rejected in 1871 for just a few of these reasons. It lacked a clear dramatic soprano and tenor role, there was no love plot, and there wasn't even any dancing. Fortunately, he was roommates with Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov at this point, and spent much of the next year rewriting Boris to fit the standards and practices. And while the authorities still didn't like it, they allowed it to be performed. César Cui said that it got some of the biggest applause that he ever heard. Borodin believed that both Musorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov benefited from this arrangement, as Rimsky-Korsakov learned from Musorgsky how to better write naturalistic text setting, whereas he felt that Rimsky-Korsakov's presence helped to moderate the rough-around-the-edges style that Musorgsky used. At this point, Musorgsky's life was, and there's no nice way to say it, kind of falling apart. While he'd gotten a better post in the forestry department, Rimsky-Korsakov moved out in 1872 when he got married. By 1875, after the dissolution of the group by any standard, and given that Balakirev was very withdrawn and they weren't even on good terms to begin with even before then, Musorgsky did write to his old friend Stasov that he felt like all of the old members of the handful were, quote, soulless. He felt like Rimsky-Korsakov's music had become too academic, and Cui's had become too formulaic, and that they would just do so much better for themselves if they just went outside and talked to people. The other handful members were also quite concerned about him. It seems as though only Rimsky-Korsakov's presence was able to keep Musorgsky from falling into a deep alcoholic depression. Perhaps the saddest thing about spiraling in this manner was that drinking was such a huge part of his social circle, particularly for those who, like Musorgsky, believed that they were anti-establishment or somehow sticking it to the man. For Musorgsky and his friends, drinking was their life, to the point that he had very few friends aside from those who basically lived and drank their lives away at squalid taverns. But it wasn't all boozing it up, as compositions from this period attest, and is corroborated by his correspondence with Stasov. He finally knew what he wanted to do with his music. The question was, would he write it? Short answer, yes. Look no further than the landmark piano suite Pictures at an Exhibition, in memory of his friend, the painter Victor Hartmann, who had died the previous year from an aneurysm. This was another factor in his drinking. He lost a lot of people close to him. Pictures at an Exhibition is known today in its orchestral version, orchestrated by Maurice Ravel in 1922, but the piano version is still quite popular as well. Musorgsky based his movements on various Hartmann paintings, some of which he had in his possession, others of which he encountered during a big Hartmann exhibit organized by Stasov in early 1874. Not only are the movements of these all unique little character pieces in their own right, but he linked them all together through the use of 5 unnumbered movements, all entitled Promenade, which serve as variations on a theme in a certain way, leading from one picture to the next. The piece, which would prove to be one of his most performed, if not the most performed, wasn't even published during his lifetime. It took 5 years after his death to be published, and even then, only because Stasov pushed for it. Many performers of his time felt like the piece was non-pianistic and not suitable recital material because it just wasn't showy enough. Scholarship also tends to treat pictures as an aberration in Mussorgsky's catalog, citing the fact that it is his only large-scale piano work. Scholarship has also tended to take what Stasov thought of Mussorgsky's pieces and Stasov's interpretation, Stasov's program, as though it were Mussorgsky's view himself. It waited until 1903 to be performed publicly in its original piano incarnation, as many pianists didn't want to touch it because of what they thought was its unidiomatic musical language. Exactly the same thing that had made other composers over the years, Ravel included, think that it was a great candidate for orchestration, to bring out all the rich colors that simply aren't available on the piano. Pictures is not a showpiece in the same vein as, say, Balakirev's Islame, and its shifts of color and mood throughout the suite present a unique interpretational challenge without the benefits of wowing an audience with virtuosity from beginning to end. From a structural standpoint, it's also not particularly cyclic, aside from the recurrence of the promenade material, not just in those movements, but also snippets and variations of that material in the movements proper. Mussorgsky also began new operatic projects, including the Fair at Sorochinsky, another Gogol setting, as well as Chovanshina, a historical epic. Balakirov and Stasov lobbied on his behalf to get him transferred to the cushiest government role they could find. And they succeeded in this regard because they found a new boss for him that was a big fan of folk songs and was okay with Mussorgsky going on a 3-month leave of absence to go on a concert tour. When this job was eliminated in 1880, his former superior gave him a pension on the condition that he finish his opera Chovanshina. This was a nice gesture, and it probably would have worked, but there was another group that got together and gave him a pension on the condition that he finished the Fair at Sorochinsky. To help his finances further, he got a job teaching theory and accompanying at a St. Petersburg singing school. Sadly, he would see neither of these operas to completion, as further and further tragedies drove him further and further into alcoholism. He began severely suffering the effects of his many years of alcohol abuse, culminating in seizures and uncontrollable shaking. He was dead in March 1881, having barely turned 42 years old. It was up to his friends to go through his files and see what they could find and bring these unfinished pieces into the light of day. When Musorgsky died, Stasov asked Rimsky-Korsakov if he would take the lead on editing his old friend and roommate's works, as he felt like he was the best suited to imitate what Musorgsky would have done. Rimsky-Korsakov completed Chovanshina, and Cesar Cui took up the Fair at Sorochinsky project, although, and this just seems to be like a QE thing, that really didn't go anywhere. QE found work on it perplexing, having to imitate both Musorgsky's unique writing style as well as Gogol's writing style, and drawing from the Ukrainian folk tunes that Musorgsky seemed to have used in the composition that he actually was able to get done. It is fair to say that Rimsky-Korsakov did take the brunt of this completion work, and in 1886 published his version of Night on Bald Mountain. This is the version which most of us concert-goers today are familiar with. While this composition tends to be ascribed to Musorgsky, it would be more fair to say that it's a Rimsky-Korsakov piece that just happened to be assembled from various Musorgsky themes. It was so thoroughly reworked that it's much more a Rimsky-Korsakov piece in its form and orchestration and its handling of just the piece and materials itself than what Musorgsky would have done. In fact, what Musorgsky did. This piece gained immediate fame after its premiere in St. Petersburg in its Rimsky-Korsakov arrangement, and even further when it was used in Walt Disney's 1940 animated classic Fantasia in a version that was arranged not by Rimsky-Korsakov, but by the conductor Leopold Stokowski. It would almost be another 30 years before Musorgsky's original version was published. Listeners familiar with the Rimsky-Korsakov version often find Musorgsky's version strange and rough around the edges, with almost inexplicable choices in the orchestration. I personally quite like it, actually, but I can understand why an orchestration expert such as Rimsky-Korsakov would have found reason to clean it up. Rimsky stated that his job was to use his talents to filter his friend's music and make it more widely known and appreciated. And it's true that Maurice Ravel's arrangement and orchestration of Pictures at an Exhibition isn't entirely faithful to the original either, but this is mostly because he was working from the wrong version. There were some errors in the version that Ravel was working from. In Rimsky-Korsakov's case, he almost felt obliged to edit it and make it more palatable to audiences. That Musorgsky's original vision for the piece would just go over audiences' heads, and his genius wouldn't actually shine through. Curiously, even the completed works were redone, as Rimsky took to a complete re-editing of Boris Godunov in 1896 and again in the early 1900s. And keep in mind, this was a piece that Musorgsky himself had already completely reworked under the auspices of Rimsky. So why would he do something like that? The reason for so much posthumous editing was that the other members of the Mighty Handful might have regarded Musorgsky as a genius in coming up with ideas, but a blithering idiot when it came to almost anything else. Even this group, which originally came together and bonded over their shared distaste for teaching composition techniques and compositional styles and formula, became frustrated at Musorgsky's lack of compositional chops and compositional techniques. They were frustrated because they saw this incredible wellspring of talent, but no desire to shape and mold that into workable pieces of music that would showcase that talent and genius. But ironically, especially in the case of Bald Mountain, the revisions take away what's so thrilling about the original. Rimsky believed that Musorgsky's orchestration sucked, which he does do some pretty unusual things, so I'll give him that, and also that his voice leading was terrible. Balakirev and Stasov privately agreed in 1863 that Musorgsky was an idiot who had no way of translating what he wanted into his music. And I can understand why Musorgsky came to resent these people if they treated him anything in person like they did in their surviving correspondences. Tchaikovsky, who had a distant relationship to Balakirev and the other members, believed Musorgsky to be an original mind who was too caught up in groupthink, and who delighted in a coarse and unfinished musical style. He saw him as a hopeless composer who nonetheless found a way to speak a new language, likely because he was obsessed with being an objective composer who described his experiences as blatantly as he could. Musorgsky's work is unique even among the other members of the Mighty Handful, whereas the other members were desirous of creating a Russian school that was simply apart from other Western influences. He was distinctly trying to avoid all Western influence, in that whatever a Western composer would do, he would want to do the opposite. It wasn't an evolution apart from Western principles, it was an evolution in complete opposition to it. This puts him at the other end of the spectrum from, for instance, César Cui, whose music is a lot more melodious and typically a little more Western and refined. The others, Balakirev, Borodin, and Rimsky-Korsakov, all thought there were things about the West that they liked, even if they thought that Bach and Mozart were blasé. Musorgsky, especially as the group fell apart, saw himself as the only one who was truly dedicated to what the group said that they espoused. And the nicer, cleaned-up versions of his works that Rimsky-Korsakov had put forward to the public are now falling away in favor of Musorgsky's originals. Musorgsky's penchant for unusual harmonies and orchestrations don't sound that far removed from a 20th century composer trying to explore new sounds with old ensembles. Modern analysis has revealed a composer who intuitively crafted a harmonic language that did exactly what it needed to do. There is a hidden logic behind what chords he chose to follow with other chords. They just weren't aligned with the standards and practices that even Russian anti-academic composers thought of as basic and essential forms of the musical language. For instance, he was fond of following one chord with another chord whose root was a tritone away. And if you think that this has some similarities to jazz and tritone substitution, you wouldn't be entirely wrong. He also liked dominant seventh chords going literally anywhere but the expected tonic, and he was often fond of unusual inversions of chords that you wouldn't find in the common practice. This man ended a song on a dominant seventh chord in 1868. What's curious is that even though Musorgsky's music can be raw and dissonant, he doesn't use rawness or dissonance for its particular inherent properties. There's always a reason that he uses these chords, and it's more in the voice leading and how things work than a crunchy sonority. I think it's fair to say that his voice leading was so unique that to his fellow colleagues it came across as incompetence. Yet, as is true with all the members of the group, the techniques that Musorgsky used are pulled directly from the folk music of Russia. Musorgsky's music actually had a major impact in France. In 1875, the French composer Camille Saint-Saëns paid a visit to Tchaikovsky, and while in Russia purchased a copy of Boris Godunov, a piece, and composer for that matter, that the relatively conservative Saint-Saëns didn't like. Saint-Saëns lent the score to a friend who was interested enough in it to put on concerts and performances of other Musorgsky works that they could track down and play. Claude Debussy attended some of these concerts of Musorgsky's songs and was doubtless struck by Musorgsky's attention to mimicking the patterns of spoken Russian in sung Russian, and perhaps began wondering if he couldn't do the same thing in French, as he would eventually do in his opera Pelléas et Mélisande. Now, if you like recitative, I highly recommend this opera. Debussy was also struck by Musorgsky's unique traits, saying that his music was like an inquisitive savage who discovers music at every step made by his emotions, and praised the Russians' luminous intuition. For Musorgsky, the form of a piece had to be subservient to the expressive qualities of a piece. Looking at Musorgsky's output can be frustrating because it's so dotted with unfinished works and abandoned projects, and often, to get a feel for Musorgsky's works, you gotta listen to various other composers' takes on his work, either in trying to imitate his style or smooth out the rough edges. You have to listen past those who edited and worked on his scores after his death. The problem is that the roughness of his music makes his music sound like his music. Unlike the other members of the handful, Mussorgsky never took to taking and molding real folk tunes, instead trying to develop a style sui generis. One can only wonder what he would have done had he not fallen into alcoholism and lived longer to see through more operas. Mussorgsky was not concerned with trying to mess with or otherwise contain his music from the outside in, but rather from the inside looking out. "I want to create the people," Mussorgsky once said. "I sleep and see them, eat and think about them, drink and they haunt me. An organic unity, immense, not all painted up and sugar-coated." By defining art as a way of conversing with people, he spoke to a depth of the human condition that few others have ever dared to plumb.